reaching out from the older kids
and then for 6 months.
But you, a lot of people that I interacted with.
And would you see Colorado?
Okay. Yeah, right. Although, do you?
Hey everybody, we're going to get started now that we're fashion related enough. So welcome everybody. My name is Joshua New. I'm a policy analyst at the Center for Data Innovation. We are a technology policy think tank focusing on data, technology, and policy, honestly, the world of data. And we had the opportunity a couple months back to start working with Amanda Wynn and Rise about how we could leverage the data and technology policy world to fill in the gaps for sexual assault survivors' rights that normal legislative avenues cannot. So we've been working with them. I'm very happy to talk about this event. This is very topical because just recently, as Amanda will get into as we start the panel, Rise managed to get a sexual assault survivors' Bill of Rights passed the House and Senate unanimously and headed to the President's desk any day now, which is fantastic news, and hopefully that'll give us the momentum to actually start making some really interesting progress in this area, particularly around open government data, around evidence tracking, around providing survivors access to their own information. Plenty of stuff to talk about today. We'll get to all of that. But first, before I introduce the rest of the panel, we have Carrie Ettinger-Lopez from the White House. She's a White House advisor on violence against women. She cannot stay for the whole time, unfortunately, so she's going to kick us off with some opening remarks. Carrie Ettinger-Lopez serves in the White House as the advisor to Vice President Biden. And in this role, she focuses on supporting coordinating national and global efforts to combat domestic violence, sexual assault, and other forms of gender-based violence. And she is a liaison to the domestic violence and sexual assault advocacy communities. She has a very long resume. I'll let her do that so we don't do too much time at our house. Just some run of show stuff. This is being live streamed on our website, the same link that you had to register. We are live tweeting it from our account at Data Innovation. Feel free to tweet along. Use the hashtag Data Innovation if you want to have a question or comment. All the panelists bios are on the screen. And then if you're watching online, we will be taking audience questions, including questions from Twitter at the end of the event. So thanks so much. Gary.
Thanks so much, Josh, and hi to all my co-panelists and to everybody in the room. Thanks so much for having me. So as Josh mentioned, my name is Carrie Ettinger-Lopez, and I'm the Vice President's Advisor on Violence Against Women. It's a great honor to be here, and I love the fact that we're having this conversation. I'm normally in normal life a law professor, and so a lot of times we have conversations like this about how law might be one tool in the toolbox to solve a social justice problem. And so it's a lot of fun for me to be here amongst data scientists and techies and advocates to think about how that same concept translates in the data field, how data can be one tool in the toolbox in solving this larger issue of how to respond and prevent domestic violence, sexual assault, violence against women, and gender violence. So I want to just take a moment to acknowledge all of you, to thank you for the work you're doing, and to really just let you know that this conversation is so important to the Vice President and to the President and to everybody at the White House. And we're really looking forward to having conversations like this continue even long after we're gone. So we say with a little bit of a tear in our eyes. I want to just also mention this is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, so it's an especially appropriate time for us to be having this conversation. So today I want to discuss one of my, excuse me, let me just grab my coffee. I want to talk about the area of law enforcement response to domestic violence and sexual assault. Many of you may know this, but in many police jurisdictions, calls for 911 service are represented over 50% of those calls are for domestic violence and sexual assault calls. And it's always struck me that given this reality, we have such a dearth of data out there on the scope of the problem. Are there particular hotspots in communities where we see heightened areas of domestic violence and sexual assault? And if so, what are the average police response times in those communities? What are the racial and ethnic breakdowns and sexual orientation, gender identity breakdowns in terms of how the police are responding? How many arrests are made? What are the sex and race of the victim and the assailant? And how can we improve transparency and accountability? And so in this country, we're in the midst of this important national dialogue excuse me, on issues of bias and implicit bias in the criminal justice system, and specifically in the law enforcement arena. And it's so important that we make sure we're looking at all of the places where, excuse me, I'm pregnant and sometimes the baby is moving. And sometimes we're looking at all the places where bias may exist on the basis of race or sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, immigration status, disability, and the frequent intersection of these complex identities. Equally important is the need for transparent data and the need for survivors to have access to their own data. And that this is so important that we do so in a way that both protects victim privacy and safety, but also increases transparency. Two places where the federal government has been involved in this work are the White House's Policing Data Initiative and the DOJ's Gender Bias Policing Guidance, both of which I want to talk about today. So when we take the time to have these deep dive conversations like the one we're having today, we can advance our collective knowledge base and also develop policies that meet victims and survivors where they're at and respond to their needs. I want to take a moment to just back up and talk about how we got here. Many of you know that the Violence Against Women Act from 1994 was a landmark act that the Vice President championed, then Senator Biden. And that Violence Against Women Act and other federal laws have really helped to build the criminal justice capacity and expertise and trained thousands of officers, and has resulted in a more effective law enforcement response to domestic and sexual violence. Law enforcement has become a critical partner for so many domestic and sexual violence advocates nationwide. But we know that reports periodically surface of law enforcement agencies failing to investigate or adequately respond to domestic and sexual violence. And a failure to properly respond to crimes of violence against women can have many causes, and this has been explored in different ways, and I want to talk about a couple ways in which we're looking at it in the federal government. It can be due to insufficient funding and personnel, outdated protocols and tracking systems, underlying gender biases, victim blaming stereotypes, a lack of understanding of how the law enforcement value of robust responses. So, for example, identifying DNA hits and arresting serial offenders in the context of testing rape kits. Also, the low value that law enforcement or prosecutorial leadership may play on domestic violence, sexual assault arrests and prosecutions. And so in December of last year, many of you may know that the DOJ, the Department of Justice, announced new guidance to help law enforcement agencies on preventing gender bias in response to sexual assault and domestic violence. And they highlighted the need for clear policies, robust training, and responsive accountability. The guidance has a series of detailed case studies, and I really recommend that you take a look at these, which advise law enforcement agencies to incorporate principles, and one of them is about open data, and that's where I want to kind of go next. Before I go there, though, I just want to kind of underscore a few data points that were presented by advocates kind of leading up to this guidance. So, how many of you are familiar with the National Domestic Violence Hotline? Okay, so most folks in the room, but not everybody. So, the DV Hotline just celebrated its, 20th anniversary. They've received over 4 million communications from survivors, friends, family members, advocates over the course of the past 20 years. And they did a national survey where they surveyed 637 women who called the hotline during a 1-month period in 2015. 52% of those callers had not interacted with the police about their abusive experiences. And they cited the desire for privacy, the fear of retaliation, fear of escalation and violence, and fear that they would not be believed as reasons behind their calling. And 48% said they had interacted with the police. But what's so interesting from those numbers is that of those 48%, only 1 in 7 said that they would call the police in the future. So that's so important as a foundation for this conversation today, right? About when we think about who is interacting with the police, even to begin with, and the vast numbers of people that aren't even being accounted for when we think about police data. We know that these statistics are not reflective of all victims' experiences. There are many police departments out there that have great interactions with survivors, with victims, with advocates, and that are working hard to continually improve their responses. And I'm pleased to announce that just today, I believe there was a Department of Justice announcement of $9.4 million in grants that were just announced to implement that gender-biased policing guidance, which is great news. And that means that federal money will be going towards many different pieces of that guidance, including Principle 8, which, as I mentioned, focuses on the data piece, on improving the collection and dissemination of data in the domestic violence and sexual assault arena. So just to kind of lead to the last part, what I want to talk about is the Policing Data Initiative. And that'll come up a lot more in the conversation. The role of data in enhancing our understanding of the realities of law enforcement response to domestic violence and sexual assault really cannot be understated. Last May, as you know, the President announced a new initiative, the Policing Data Initiative, which is supposed to be a tangible response to the President's recommendations for the 21st Century Task Force, the report on policing that preceded that. And as you know, PDI is an opportunity for departments to better use data and technology to build community trust. And it has several goals. You're probably familiar with them, but just to reiterate, one is to accelerate progress around data transparency and analysis. The second is to strengthen accountability. And the third is to establish a community of practice that will allow for knowledge sharing, community source problem solving, and the establishment of best practices that can serve as examples for police departments nationwide. Collectively, and this data may be a little outdated, but there are 61 police departments covering more than 41 million people who have committed to PDI and released over 150 open data sets. And all of those can be found on policedatainitiative.org. And so each PDI city, the idea here is that they commit to releasing these data sets on policing, sharing in a community of practice where they can share successes and challenges. And so civic hackers and advocates and others provide the substantive expertise and technical assistance on common barriers to transparency. And the 21st Century Task Force on Policing has found, of course, that transparency increases trust between law enforcement agencies and the communities that they serve. And data is a key piece of this. We went to Orlando in last January, or this past January, I believe, with the National Network to End Domestic Violence and other local advocates in Orlando, along with city officials and police officials there. And we hosted, really the Orlando Police Department hosted a hackathon where there were civic hackers, data scientists, and city officials. And we really reached this point there where they were hoping to come out of this hackathon with concrete principles on how we could divulge, open data sets from the Orlando Police Department. And these were, I would say, these Orlando officials are really to be commended. They were thinking outside the box. They were so invested in this project. And I have to say, we left a little bit stumped. The advocates in the room were really concerned about the victim privacy and safety issues that could be implicated by releasing these open data sets, how you might be able to identify a specific person or a specific issue on a particular block. And the civic hackers and the data scientists in the room were trying to grapple with that balance of transparency and privacy. And so we decided to host a meeting at the White House this past April that some of you participated in. It was called Opportunities and Challenges, Open Police Data and Ensuring the Safety and Security of Victims of Intimate Partner Violence and Sexual Assault. And there again, we kind of got into the complexities of all these issues and left, I think, with more ideas, but still a little bit stumped as to how we could navigate and kind of, safely navigate this area while making progress. And I'm so excited to hear more about NNEDV, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and the Police Foundation's forthcoming strategies and tips document that you're going to be producing, and then promising practices that really have come from those convenings and those opportunities to really do a deep dive into some of these issues. So we know open data is happening, and it's something that the White House is very supportive of. The train has left the station. It's a trend throughout the nation, and we need to make sure that domestic violence and sexual assault don't get left behind, right? That they're counted in this data, and that they're not rendered invisible. But we have to do so in a way, of course, that respects victim privacy, safety, and confidentiality. And so I so appreciate this conversation today as a way to really advance those goals. I just want to end by saying something that I always kind of talk about on behalf of the Vice President, which is that the Vice President talks about the need for culture change, the need for a culture shift. And so the role of data in that culture shift is so important and really critical, and all of you in this room who are thinking about that are going to help us to kind of make that shift. We need to think about holding individuals and institutions accountable for complying with the law and for spurring that larger culture shift. And that means holding ourselves and the federal government accountable as well. I want to just say, in closing, my proudest moments in this administration have been when we've taken a hard look at where stereotypes and biases lie in our system, and we've developed legal and social frameworks that focus not only on individual accountability, but also on systemic reform. And these initiatives must address root causes, challenge stereotypes of victims, curb victim blaming, make headway on the prevention front, and bring to the center those survivors who have traditionally been placed at the margins: women of color, the disabled, LGBTQs, immigrants, and older adults among them. And so data is one way in which we can help to understand these complex phenomena, these complex social phenomena, and really get at some of the roots in terms of changing the culture. So thank you for having me today. Sorry, I'm a little bit queasy this morning, but I'll be sitting over on the side, eagerly listening in on this conversation. I'm going to need to duck out for about a half hour. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carrie. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to launch right into the discussion. We won't bore you with it on the line as earlier. So going down the line, we have Amanda Nguyen, who is the president and founder of RISE, which, as I mentioned, in just 7 months, they were able to pass federal legislation unanimously guaranteeing basic sexual assault survivors' rights, which is fantastic. And the bill will affect at least 25 million people. And for her work, she was awarded a 2016 TED Fellowship. Next to Amanda, we have Matthew Pelega, who is a co-founder and chief product officer of Mark 43, which is a law enforcement technology software startup based in New York City. They became involved in the administration's police data initiative in May of this year by launching in Camden, New Jersey, which is participating. To his left, we have Cindy Southworth, who is the executive vice president and founder of the Safety Net Technology Project at the National Network to End Domestic Violence. So she launched this project in 2002. And in that capacity, she works with the private industry, state and federal agencies, and international groups to improve safety and privacy for victims in the digital era. And then finally, last but not least, we have Allison Yellowshan, which I think I pronounced right. And she is the senior executive manager for public safety for the Northeast region for Esri, the geospatial data company. And in that capacity, Allison manages a strategic and diverse portfolio of multidisciplinary public safety organizations to help them get there at achieving geospatial objectives. So, to get started, I want to start with two unfortunately tragic stories. One in the Baltimore Police Department, and then I'm going to turn it over to Amanda to kind of frame her experience, why she started RISE. And basically, these two stories will exemplify everything that's wrong with the criminal justice system and how data can help. So it might be a little bit pessimistic in the beginning, but I promise we'll end up. So just a few months ago, the Department of Justice completed concluded investigation of the Baltimore Police Department. And it's like a 100-page document. There are a lot of really pretty egregious things in there, but there's whole sections on how the Baltimore Police Department failed sexual assault survivors in their investigations. And it was like the terrible poster child of everything that a police department should not be doing. There were thousands of rape kits that were just sitting in a room untested. Some were lost. There was really incredible amounts of implicit and explicit bias influencing investigators' decisions, either dismissing cases, not taking them seriously, not taking victims seriously, deliberately miscoding sexual assault reports to the kind of like juke stats. If you've ever seen The Wire, that's the only thing I can compare it to. They can demonstrate on paper a dramatic decline in the number of rapes happening in Baltimore when we know that there's no actual substantive difference in happening, just it changes how they report. And these problems were systemic from the police officers on the street to senior level officials. And this is not to say that they are all, of course, they're not. It's not always happening necessarily out of malice. There are a lot of issues where it's simply issues of technology, of culture, of training. They don't have the technology nurses to do this correctly. And we'll get a little bit more personal with Amanda and how her experience, pretty much dealing with those same exact issues.
Yeah. Y'all hear me? Yes. I can hear myself. Thank you so much for having this conversation, for being here today, to our panelists, and thank you, Carrie, for the White House's focus on this issue. RISE has been so fortunate to be in a climate of a society that right now is caring about this issue. And RISE was founded from a very personal place in my life. I am a survivor, and when I went to get a rape kit, which most people don't know lasts 3 to 7 hours, mine was 6 hours long, I then was faced with an extremely broken criminal justice system. I had tried to understand what my resources and my rights were, and I found out that in Massachusetts, untested rape kits can be destroyed at 6 months, even if the statute of limitations to press charges is 15 years. Now, conversely, convicted felons, including convicted rapists, have the right to hold on to the evidence for the duration of the conviction. And as I started reaching out to resources and researching what my rights were, I found out that across the United States there were different civil rights provisions in place, either tracking kits, having standard operating procedures in place, and either holding the kits into the statute of limitations or processing them in a timely manner. And they vary wildly from state to state, even within states, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, which then compelled me to really talk publicly about my story. And when I did, I received so many stories back from survivors, not only in Massachusetts, but across the United States, saying, this is happening to me too. I just remember once walking into my local area rape crisis center, and the waiting room was filled, and I thought to myself, if I have the resources that I do, and this is what I'm going through, and a lot of it is bureaucratic tape that isn't individual malicious intent. It was just structurally a broken system. What is everybody else that doesn't have my resources going through? So that's where we started looking into, in a data analytical, comparative way, how we can start changing this. I don't want to go too much into this because I know we have some amazing panelists focusing on data today. So we wrote this bill originally from Massachusetts, which, by the way, is having its final vote today. And so we're waiting the news. This one, when it passes, means that I will never have to fight to extend my kit again from being destroyed. So this one in the States literally is where my rights on the line. But yes, last week, the United States Congress took notice and passed our federal version unanimously on the record, 399 to 0 in the House, 89 to 0 in the Senate. And we're very proud of that. Thank you, Josh, for being part of the team.
So going down the line to let everyone get a chance to start the discussion, we outlined a lot of these major issues. mismanaging evidence, losing evidence, destroying evidence, not having good reporting mechanisms, having reporting mechanisms that can, explicitly be manipulated, not having a good understanding of sexual assault on a federal level because statistics are bad. And then there's issues of providing survivors with access to their own information. So from your perspective in the private sector, from working with police departments to working with the criminal justice system in general, why do these problems happen? So I guess we'll start with that, then we'll bring it back around. From a law enforcement perspective, why can't something, so Amanda used this example before, it's like if you can track a pizza from Domino's on your phone, why can't you track a rape? Like that's a relatively simple technology solution. It's just a simple issue of tracking like an RFID chip. Why can't we do that in police departments? What are the technical barriers there?
Yeah, the biggest thing that we see are that a lot of processes that police departments have built to deal with evidence tracking, to deal with reporting were built 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And while technology has progressed to the point where all these young officers are saying, I have this cool iPhone, I have this Android, I have these awesome apps where I could track a pizza, do something like that. Why can't the software that I'm using day to day in my policing job feel like that? And that's very much because we've seen police departments fit this new technology to their old processes. So instead of actually sitting down and looking at where all this red tape is and actually breaking that down and trying to actually get through that, we see these departments that are still stuck in their ways from 20, 25 years ago. So they're definitely hamstrung by the process.
So maybe they're technical barriers, maybe they're cultural barriers, maybe it's an issue of resources, but Cindy and Allison have gone away.
I mean, there's so many barriers to addressing sexual assault and domestic violence. Technology is absolutely one of them. Having worked in courts and police departments and seen the blue screen legacy systems that are just painful, like no mouse. Amazing to even imagine somebody computing without a mouse or a touchscreen. And at the same time, data and technology is the tool. What we need to change is the hearts and minds of our communities, our neighbors, our friends, and we need to change the hearts and minds of the police officers because the data is the tool, but they'll prioritize rape kits and they'll prioritize sexual assault cases as we chip away at misogyny. Like we need to actually end the bias and have people take seriously domestic violence and sexual assault reports. So that for me, the technology isn't the solution, it's just a tool to help us get to the solution, which is radical social change.
So unlike, many of my panelists here, you guys have a lot of experience, in justice, in criminal justice matters, and I've got a lot of experience in GIS and location information. So on the public safety team, I have, at Esri, I have a great opportunity to go out and meet a lot of our customers that are, municipal, county governments, primarily, sometimes state governments. And whether it's, law enforcement, fire, or emergency management, specifically talking about law enforcement. And I agree with what you're saying, Cindy, about, a cultural change. It's not always about the technology, but they really have to see the technology as the tool. And the tool is there. It exists. About every one of these customers I meet with are, have this technology that's already there. So a lot of times I'm just telling them, they don't know what they don't know. So I'm like, hey, we already have these apps. You don't have to deal with this paper legacy system anymore. You can move from the paper to this platform and it's 3 clicks and it's really easy to use. So, but then it's then enabling to change those workflows. And the processes are difficult, but there is this momentum for wanting to do it, but I haven't quite put my finger on what the problem is in kind of adopting that new technology. There is some kind of a barrier, whether it's just at the top or it's funding or it's resources, but there is definitely a desire. The desire is definitely there to change and bring in this technology so they can collect this data, but there's some barriers there. I think it's resource driven, actually.
So tying it back to what Carrie mentioned about the DOJ grant, which is news to me, that sounds fantastic. The role of bias in policing. We wrote an article a while back on this issue about responding to the Baltimore Police Department investigation about how the relationship between really, really bad statistics, like deliberately manipulated data, and in cases where it's not manipulated, there's just so many different ways to count sexual assault, which seems like a weird problem to have. It's like it either happened or it didn't. But the Government Accountability Office a couple months ago released a report finding, like a dozen different data collection initiatives around sexual assault across like 8 different federal agencies. and they all have different definitions of sexual assault. They all have different reporting mechanisms. They all serve different audiences. So there is reason for a variation. But there's estimates that between like 1995 and 2012, the FBI, like the authoritative source for sexual assault statistics, could have missed up to or over 1 million rapes in that 7-year period. So hopefully, can you talk about one?
Josh, just one clarification. You're talking about reported incidents, not actual occurrences.
Correct.
And just that they're, the National Crime Victimization Survey tells us that we have like 1 in 3, 1 in 4, 1 in 5 women will be raped in our lifetime. We know it's prevalent. We know it's rampant. We know it's everywhere. When we talk about these reports that you're talking about, it's either reporting service delivery, reporting police reports, reporting SANE exams, SART exams, the sexual assault nurse exams, rape kits. But those are actions a survivor might take versus the experience.
So, and actually
Just to clarify.
and thank you for doing it, because that's an issue that I wanted to bring up. The difference between the data we have on how much we know this actually happens versus the official statistics of how much police are being involved, which I want to talk about the role of that bad data or potentially misleading data and how that can kind of fuel these subconscious biases, either whether it's like the really toxic discussions around, the belief that people will falsely report sexual assault issues at higher rates than other crimes. Police departments might not think this is a big enough problem as it actually is, or policymakers might not give this issue the resources it deserves. So in your experience, how either, whether it's on the ground working with police, how bad data affects our day-to-day, or on a higher level, on a policymaking level, how this bad data affects bias and how people approach this issue in general? Anyone wants to weigh in?
I'm going to just keep unpacking this just a little bit. I'm like a dog with a bone on this. And part of it is that bad data is bad data. And sometimes it's human error, somebody checking the wrong dropdown, and they're checking dropdown of assault level C offense versus sexual assault in a database. And then it ends up published on a public police data initiative website where they redact sexual assault identifying information, but they don't identify or redact criminal assault. So sometimes it's human error, but the other sort of flip of that is people tend to think increased reporting equals increased prevalence. And sometimes you get increased reporting in a community because you've got a really good police department who's on the street doing community policing. It's community policing week, just saying. And survivors come forward. They feel comfortable reporting their sexual assault, their domestic violence case when they have trust of the police department. So the reason I'm so nuanced around data and reporting is saying that's a piece of it, but that doesn't actually, it's not the full narrative.
So what you had mentioned is that, I was hoping to get to this as well, but now's a good time. So the issue of like, once you actually start doing this right, so say Baltimore completely did 100%, 180 on how they actually report their sexual assault statistics, and they have, people feel comfortable reporting it, they're much more transparent with this data. On paper, it's going to look like Baltimore has like a dramatic increase in the number of sexual assaults. And from a political perspective, from a PR perspective, how can we encourage police departments to actually do this right without making them afraid of the blowback they might receive from having this data be out in the open for once? So in your experience, like working with police, are they willing to take on this risk, or is this like a political pressure they're not willing to touch like a third rail? Or if they are, how do we kind of encourage that adoption?
I think for us, what we've seen is that setting context is everything. So even in something as innocuous as defining, some new type of traffic crash or fender bender or something like that. Traffic accidents in DC may go through the roof, but as long as the police department can explain, we changed the definition of, why this traffic accident went up. Actually, these statistics are changing as well because of it. I think it goes to the exact same thing with sexual assault. So, again, exactly what you guys said. It's not so much that there's crazy incidents of new sexual assaults, and this is becoming even more of a rampant problem, but more so the community feels more engaged, they're more comfortable presenting more calls for service and that kind of thing. So, again, setting the context around it is everything, and we've seen the public is pretty responsive to that.
And I also think it's not a new issue. The universities right now are right in this because as we mandate that universities report their crime stats, they're worried that you're not going to send your son or daughter to their university because it looks like they have a higher rate of domestic violence or sexual assault. And I'm going to go on the record. If there's a high reporting rate, send your kid there.
Absolutely.
Because that means you've got a university who's really taking it seriously, getting the reports in and actually publicizing them. Like, if anybody thinks the prevalence is different on one campus to the next, they are so wrong. So the reality is, are the reports coming in and are they being handled?
Go ahead.
Well, just, I was gonna, agree with what you guys both said, but Matthew, to your point of context, as soon as, Josh was talking there, I wrote down context. And so in my mapping world, that's what maps do. They provide insight to that data. So like you're saying, this reporting would kind of show this trend. And if you just push a number out there, then somebody can grab a hold of that number and then just start to run with this number. But when you use geography and you use location-based information and you use GIS to kind of provide contents and tell that broader story, because there's a broader story there that needs to be told, then I think that then provides the level of context around a situation like this that is really needed.
So going back, I want to talk about bias a little bit because I know, Amanda, we've talked about this before. In your experience, you have a pretty large network of survivors that you work with. And I've heard some of their stories about the role that, because there's not good data out there to inform decision making, police can be very dismissive of sexual assault survivor stories. Could you talk about some of the examples that you've seen where, like, if we actually had good data to point to, saying, no, that's absolutely wrong. Whether or not, I know you've had this working with people in Congress on this issue, actually convincing them it's a problem because the data's not there.
Exactly. So first off, there is absolutely truth to the fact that survivors may feel hesitant to go to the police because they feel that there's this bias, often known as rape culture. And to add to the other side of this, the reason why we were able to have such resounding support for our initiatives is because we did absolutely take into account context, especially on a human level. For some of the rights that we worked on, we engaged law enforcement community not in an antagonistic way, but truly sat down, heard their views, heard their concerns, and did probably extra efforts in trying to make sure that they were not villainized, because at the end of the day, good officers are trying to seek justice and trying to help everyone. And that's been so helpful in starting off a conversation about hard things, about biases. I mean, there are stories after stories. One of the people that is on our team who has spoken publicly about her went viral is Laura. She was compelled in Virginia to report and thrown into jail for it. She herself talks to members as we brought her in to do so, and being able to talk about it and being able to say, hey, like, we've been able to also engage with law enforcement and get to a point where people can see each other's sides has been really powerful.
Great. So bringing it back to the issue you mentioned of police departments that want to do this well. So not to demonize the ones that want to do well. There are, as we identified, there are technical reasons, there are resource reasons why they can't. What would be the single biggest solution to, whether it's like barring like a massive increase of funding or sweeping legislation that could change this? When you talk to police departments, what did they say was preventing them from actually like getting the data that they need? So something that we've talked about before is, all the reporting standards in the world that we can think of and all the tools in the world are great, but they're not going to voluntarily take on new initiatives because they are resource constrained. So what's the fix there? I know we talked about this with you, Matt, as well. But feel free to start.
It's for me a chicken and egg problem,
Sure.
And it really goes to the resources or like culture change issue, and whether or not which comes first. Well, the answer for me is it goes hand in hand, and we're, in my opinion, in a moment of a groundswell of people starting to pay attention to it more, thanks to the great work of advocates in this field and related fields. We are seeing that as people start speaking up, whether or not as survivors or as allies, and people who just have a hand in this issue, that others who may not have really understood the problem starting to recognize and register that, oh, hey, this is a problem, and start caring and thinking about solutions, right? But Matt, I think you have a great sense.
Yeah, I think kind of in our broad survey of, we're working with police departments, understanding their processes and their technology, and looking from, just even a broader data perspective, I think it's an exercise kind of in expectation setting. So when we work with departments, we kind of talk internally about this concept of like a department bill of rights, if you will, when you're working with data and you're working with any vendor in the world that's providing you some sort of software application. So as a department, you should expect that you get software that makes it easy to publish data. That's to a third party like the FBI, publish data, some dump to a public website of, all this different stuff that's going on within the department. You should expect that data is stored in a way where it's not easy for the vendor to work with. It's easy for you, the department, to actually run statistics and pull things and do what you actually need to do with it. And finally, software and technology and the processes that you're working with every day should be easy enough and enjoyable enough for your users that instead of them dreading actually the monotonous exercise of inputting all this data and actually recording all these statistics, it should be a pleasant experience. We very much see that a happy police officer is very much an effective police officer. So once you can get those departments to understand, this is what I deserve. This is what I should have for my force, for my rank and file. I think that'll be kind of the first big step in actually moving in the right direction.
And one other piece, we work really closely with our partner, the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, and Ebony Tucker's here, and lots of partners in the room. And one of the pieces that Amanda talked about is it's hand in hand. It's resources and it's the culture change. And one of the things that we did in the Violence Against Women Act in 1994 is basically dangle resources and say, here's funding for your police department, prosecutor's office, courthouse. But to get the money, you have to partner with your local rape crisis center and domestic violence program, depending on what it was. Funded sexual assault response teams, funded all sorts of really innovative work. And it's never, VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, has never been fully funded. And so the fact that funding for domestic violence and sexual violence work in this country is like budget dust, as Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky calls it. It is such a tiny part of our discretionary funding. And so if we were to fully fund VAWA, fully fund FIPSA, and increase VOCA even more, and start getting the resources on the ground, that makes a difference. It doesn't solve if you don't have a champion in the department. If you don't have your detective who is the detective that the Rape Crisis Center says, you need to talk to this detective, this is the right one. So you still need to have your champions and your folks inside the department engaged and excited and really wanting to end sexual and domestic violence. But the resources do make a difference. And so for me, as we're talking about data and innovation, I want everybody following the live stream to push for full funding. That's a piece of it.
Sure.
If I may ask a question, Josh.
Sure.
Cindy, why do you think Congress hasn't fully funded these initiatives or VAWA?
Misogyny? I'm sorry. My throat. No, I'm joking, but we do not prioritize violence against women in this country. Just domestic violence homicides, it's 1,500 women die every year. That's one World Trade Center every year. Staggering, and we don't have a TSA response where we're checking everyone's shoes on that same scale to responding to sexual and domestic violence. It is truly appalling that where we put our priorities and where we don't put them. And so, I had a reporter from Oregon call me and ask about how many spyware products are on the market, slightly different note, but he was just like, but why aren't we prosecuting them? They say how to spy on your spouse. That violates the federal eavesdropping law. And I'm like, yes. And he's like, and they're not prosecuting. I said, yes. Why not? It's not a priority. There's been 2 prosecutions in the 15 years I've had this project. It's not a priority. It needs to be a priority. The needle's moving. We're seeing change. The fact that there's a White House advisor on violence against women, that only started under this administration. We've never had one before. That's a start. The needle's moving, but we're not there.
I think to also elaborate on what you're talking about, the funding and for the IT systems and the technology. It'd be great. I know so many of the customers I'm so lucky to work with that, there are advocates, there are champions. I don't have a hard time finding a champion. I think the challenge for them would be is if the money would come, they need to be ready to know what to do with the money and how to move forward on it. And the IT systems a lot of them are legacy. We have a lot of data silos, I think. If you go into a county government or city government, the GIS is their system of record, so that's in place, but it's for traditional type municipal functions or county functions like transportation or planning or land use or things like that. So when it comes over to public safety and law enforcement, there's a gap there, for getting their systems. And I think sometimes they think it's just such a big kind of elephant or thing to tackle. So what I try to help them do is okay, you don't have to do it, let's iterate and move into this little by little. So that's why, again, while we have those apps, we have, operations dashboards, we have story maps, we have things that, and especially with open data, like the free open data portal, to help them kind of move into that. And then what we hope to gain is that momentum. And they say, oh, okay, well, we can leverage cloud safely with some of this data, and then we can put things behind our firewall and we can slowly move into it. But they would need to have a plan. It's a lot for them to undertake, I think, because they haven't been able to, keep in step with technology. There's like a huge leap.
I mean, and that feeds into me, one of the big things we've got to bake into this is as the push to publish data and be transparent and share it, we need to make sure we don't accidentally publish the identities of 12-year-old victims of sexual violence, which is what's been happening. And it's completely unintended, but it has a huge chilling effect. Survivors aren't going to call 911 if they think this is going to end up on the public web. And some of it is we need to make sure that and so one of the things we did in April when we co-hosted the meeting with the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women and the White House on police data and survivor privacy is we brought in some of our data scientist friends from the Federal Trade Commission. Lori Craner spoke, Simpson Garfinkel, who's a re-identification and de-identification expert. And the issue we're trying to look at is Dr. LaTanya Sweeney decades ago looked at the combination of age plus zip code plus date of birth, and you can re-identify 87% of the US population. And so if you were to just have age, not date of birth, and zip code and gender, you can re-identify a huge percentage. And so one of the things we're doing is we're trying to engage our geek friends to get them to create source code that can lay between the raw data and the public. And so if you want to search for Lori Craner in her blog post on the Federal Trade Commission website talked about how reporting in a public data set somebody's age may not be a problem if it's a college student who's assaulted in a college town. You're going to have so many young people that's not identifiable. But if the sexual assault was of a young person in a neighborhood where it's a retirement community next door, there's only one person under the age of 18. If you report that the victim was a minor, you've just identified that survivor. And so it's contextual. And we have census data that source code could query and say how many young people are in this community. Not enough. So therefore we're either going to redact the age or going to publicly appear, or we'll broaden it to county level data or precinct level data so that we don't inadvertently identify survivors. The challenge is we have to really road test that a lot because you can query something 5 different ways and scrape it together and then figure out who the person is by just running it different directions.
You're talking about your levels of geography, right? It's like a cookie
and
cutter.
the demographics
And the
too.
demographics, but are you talking about where the incident happened or talking about the address of the victim? Because
all the above.
Right, because the location of the incident is very important because oftentimes when we're trying to map these things, we come out, well, the data was collected at the hospital. So all of a sudden you get all these points dropping at the hospital. Well, the incidents didn't happen at the hospital. Hospital's all of a sudden a hot spot for rape.
But for domestic,
right?
if it says domestic violence and you put the address, you just identified the victim. So
right.
It's all the
Possibly,
above.
unless my teenage daughter is visiting her grandparents in the senior center and was walking to a store.
I'm saying sexual assault. Domestic
yeah,
violence. Domestic violence, if it happens in your home.
It's true, then that's your home location, address, right? So that's the difference between the two, location or address
So
victim.
this is a great transition, and I promise we'll start getting much more optimistic. But we started a little bit talking about champion. So open data in policing is increasingly in vogue. So with the police data initiative, as the administration's kind of one of the responses to like the Ferguson arrest is primarily focusing on uses of force and bias in policing. And it carries not quite the same level of sensitivities as sexual assault issues. So mapping police uses of force, there's more concern about implications of specific officers than implicating specific victims. But that same balance, it still needs to be struck there. So And Cindy, you had gone to this pretty thoroughly, but how can we get that? So open data in general would be crucial for understanding if a police department is cheating the statistics without a fix to the reporting system. It's crucial for understanding the problem like on a much broader level and better allocating resources. It's crucial for police departments actually knowing how they're responding to the issue because they have no idea what their internal data is unless they're publishing it in usable fashion for the most part. Matt feels very correct on that, but that's a sense that I get. So how do we strike that balance, whether it is just aggregating it to a degree where you can't re-identify anybody, whether it is having like prioritized access like survivors access to their own information versus public access in general. Well, what are some solutions that you hope to see develop over the years? Maybe they have to be tested first, but what would you like to see that I think would benefit survivors the most? Anyone feel free to jump in.
I think for us, from kind of the open data side and what you can actually publish to the public and what's the right way to do it, I definitely think there's been some work done in that previously, but especially when you get into things like the Police Data Initiative, making sure that you publish the data where you can actually do something interesting with it, I think is the most important part. If you just get a bunch of kind of anonymized narratives about what happens, you can actually understand, the basic context of the incident, but not actually, broad areas where they happen and that kind of stuff and frequency. Until you actually have good data, you can't actually measure the problem. And that's really what we see pretty often. So once you know that you're actually having data that is quality, that's, released by the department to the public, that's important for us. So the quality data that helps you measure the problem is pretty key.
Allison, are there lessons we can learn from less sensitive areas of police data that you've worked with police departments to make open or make more readily available that can apply to this issue, like any best practices?
I think spinning, to the more positive side of things, like you were saying, and kind of get there. We've done a lot of work with a lot of, police departments across the country, but Fayetteville, I would say Fayetteville, North Carolina is a really good model to look at. We were able to work with them, and they're sharing over 100 different data sets on their open data portal, several related to rapes, during different time periods, which really improves location data collection on sexual assaults. And they, also use some of our, story map templates at all, so providing that context around the data. So I think, I think the message is exactly what you said. It's hard for them to find data that they feel comfortable with and is accurate because of the back end, but when they do and when they have it, is to make sure that they share it in a way that's engaging and does really help connect with the community. One of my favorite kind of applications that I've seen a lot of folks use is the My Neighborhood Officer app. So it kind of shows where their jurisdiction is. It has their photo on there. They can also share this, easily on social media. I really like that app. So that's a positive one. I would say it's easy. That's easy information, and it's a place to get started. And then once people see that, they'll start asking questions in a different way. The people inside the police department will say, "Oh, we could probably also do this, and we could also do that." And, it just kind of gets I think things the needle moving in the right direction.
So you mentioned Fayetteville, and the issue of champions came up. Matt or Cindy or Meta, when you dealing with police or within the Police Data Initiative, who is leading the country, I guess, in open data and policing? And are they focusing on sexual assault? Is it even on their radar, or is it issue priorities where they can only do uses of force because that's where the momentum has been so far?
Are you asking for departments specifically that we?
Yeah, if it's a department, if there's people leading the charge that aren't here today, is the state or not? Yeah, anyone that's.
And I think the challenge they're in right now is they're in a bit of a conundrum. There's a lot of departments that are clamoring for guidance, saying how do we publicly release sexual violence and domestic violence data in ways that don't accidentally identify the victims.
Sure.
And some of it is it comes down to the type that the United States of America means there's 56 different states and territories and 56 different sets of laws. And so what happens with some of the statutes, the actual sodomy of a child under 12 is the actual law. And so if you list what it was charged at, you know the age of the victim is under 12. So it's so much more complicated than just did we release age, did we release gender, did we release race, do we release the exact location or community or neighborhood. And so when we sort of brought up some of these issues in April, the police departments were fantastic in responding. They said, this is really important. We want to make sure we protect the privacy of victims. Give us guidance. And that guidance is complicated because it's nuanced. It's not, if we had the answer, we would just hand it out. We're working on it now, which is partly why we're trying to get some of our data scientists engaged in this, who have been doing decades of work on de-identification and re-identification, so that we can figure out how do we publicly share information. In the meantime, there's a lot of really rich data. You can look at the work that Emily Shaw did from the Sunlight Foundation with the Baltimore police data around rape kits. She was able to compare aggregate number of cases completed, closed, arrested to the national averages. That was valuable. So my plea to people looking at open data is to not sort of create a hierarchy of data and say that aggregate data has no value and the only data that matters is one row of data about my life and my survivor story. Instead, say that all data has value. Some data has value for doing comparison, because you can compare precinct to precinct and seeing one precinct's doing a much better job than another. And I'm not opposed to incident level data. I'm just opposed to the concept that the only data that has value is incident level data, because there's a lot you can do. I would love to have people looking at their own data. So as a domestic violence or rape crisis center, look at your own records and see, do you extend shelter stay for women of color shorter or longer than your average? For rape crisis centers, when you have a waiting list, are women of color getting in faster, slower, or the same? Like, do your own internal gut check and say, are we meeting the needs of our community? And then it's a lot easier to then call the police officers that you partner with on their response. But you need to look internally first and look at all data, not just incident level data.
We actually worked pretty closely with the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, and roughly 12 or 14 months ago, they actually hired a chief privacy officer. So that isn't something that we've seen super typically across most police departments, but Liz Lyons over at the NPD focuses specifically on, okay, when we're actually releasing victim data, what can we release, especially in the case of minors. There's a lot of things that you take into account. And that has a bunch of wide-ranging implications as well. So DC is pretty, they're pretty liberal in the terms of kind of the public reporting that they do and allowing reports to be accessible to the public. That just puts more onus on their chief privacy officer to make sure that they're releasing information that's appropriate for the public to see. But that's been a huge step forward, and it's been great for us to work with them in that capacity.
So we were at about 10 o'clock. I want to open it up to audience Q&A very soon. I have about one or two more questions I want to ask. We're going to get starting really optimistic. So Amanda, could you provide a brief overview of the Bill of Rights that was passed in Congress, the kind of basic protections that it outlines, that then we can start, okay, now we have national standards around very basic things. How can we start focusing on the data aspect? How can we actually build on that now that everyone's on the same page?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start off talking about the theory that set it into place and what we're seeing is happening. So when we started looking at what rights exist across the states and started mapping it out, we found that there were such huge disparities between the states. And our goal was to take the ones that were supported by everybody, the best practices, and put them together. And then we vetted it through many people and came to the final bill that has now passed. Obviously, there were a lot of things that we wish we could have put in there, but that's why we have to do it state by state, because every local community has solutions that best fit that local community. The theory, though, is that why we did this on the federal level, even though the bill largely only impacts, federal territories, federal courts. There's a part of it that gives a grant to attorney generals that does impact all states. If attorney generals may choose to, take on that grant. But the reason why we did it on the federal level is because it's very simple, and that's the theory of change. And the theory of change is that hope is contagious, and that if you have a problem, and this is a problem, and you're able to provide a first step solution that people understand, then people, when they understand it, will be empowered to take it and model it in their own states. And so far, in total, 14 states, either state legislators or activists in those states have reached out and said, I heard about this bill, we need this bill, we want to model it, how can I do something in my own community, in my own state to do it? And to see that really, it's been inbound requests, has been remarkable. So what's in this bill? They're so basic. So the first one is to not destroy untested rape kits for the duration of the statute of limitations. And even in the states, it varied so greatly. So Massachusetts is 6 months, New Hampshire is 2 months where they destroy untested kits. There's one place in Florida that destroys it in 30 days. I cannot even imagine that. And in order for this to change, we actually have to pass it in state houses.
And Amanda, that's a bare minimum. That's not the gold standard.
No.
Right, because California just extended their statute of limitations.
Exactly.
So, in an ideal world, we wouldn't be destroying any kids.
Exactly. And the thing is that people didn't know that this was happening, and that goes to why it is so important to even shed light on the fact that this is a problem. Second one, being able to request an extension on your kit from being destroyed. As I'm saying this, is just so surreal. Actually, my next rape kit destruction deadline is next week, and so
Unless the bill passes.
unless the bill passes, then I will be able to write to my crime forensic lab and say, per the bill, cannot destroy my kit or anybody else's in Massachusetts anymore, and can't wait to send that email. But yeah, just the simple right to request an extension of your kit. Another right is the right to critical information, medical information within your kit. So, for instance, HIPAA, you're supposed to be able to access your own patient information because HIPAA doesn't specifically say in cases of rape or sexual assault, you must be able to access it. That's why survivors are getting denied access to their own medical information. Repeatedly, we have situations like this, so that's another one. The right to not have to pay for kits or associated medical costs. And so, again, VAWA had provisions about this, but enforcement is an issue, as it is an issue for a lot of federal bills. And this reiterates again that, and specifically says, in cases of associated medical problems as well, or to the relation of collecting evidence from the kit. Another one that's really basic is the right to be notified of your rights. So basic, but so important. In California, you have the right to be admitted to the hospital in a place that has a rape kit when you identify as a survivor, or be told where to go for resources, and the survivor did go, and she was turned away from the hospital, saying that she had to report first. She said, fine, but there's a reason why rape kits are timely. It's because it's biological evidence, and by the time that she reported, waited in the ER, went in, the drugs that were in her system had run out. And she came back with toxicology report, it's nothing, and the DA dropped her charges. So she did everything the system asked her to, but in this case had the police officers or the hospital had to tell her what her rights were, let her in, maybe her situation would be different. The last part of the bill is a task force between the Department of Justice and HHS to assess the effectiveness of these rights. Half of the battle is getting these rights codified into law, the other half is actually implementing them. And this task force serves as an ongoing conversation so that it's just, not just this, and critically, our fight extends to the states, and so that's the next step that guys will be taking.
Great. So one quick question and turn it over to audience Q&A. So if you had your druthers, from a data perspective, what is the most important thing and the most valuable thing that the administration or Congress could do to improve how the criminal justice system deals with sexual assault, better using data? We've talked about things like just getting people in the same room together and having this conversation, like extending the task force to establish best practices. We've talked about more resources for things like better technology technology systems. We've talked about better statistics. What do you think would be the most helpful here? If you could pick one thing that the Obama administration could do in the next couple of months before they're out, or Congress could do?
Literally, just say it's an issue. People don't know how broken the system is for survivors, the criminal justice system is. And there's been great conversations in the space, particularly to college campuses. People do not know that kids are getting destroyed. People do not know that survivors are getting denied a copy of their own police report. And this is news to a lot of people. And so in regards to data, I mean, just having people, principals, and the administration, admit is the wrong word, but you recognize that this is an issue is like the bare minimum first step. But even if it's a low lift, it has a huge impact, high impact for visibility.
I think, only having a few more months, this may be a little optimistic, but deploying some sort of broader standard to all these different police departments on what to collect and the right way to collect it is really important. Right now, police departments, there's 18,000 of them. They report to all these different, either state legislatures or a little bit to the FBI if you're a little bit federal, but maybe not the FBI otherwise. Again, maybe the governor or the mayor of, some town or whatever wants to actually collect some bit of information for some period of time. So everybody's collecting all this different data. And again, while the FBI defines a small sliver of what you should be collecting and what they need in their annual stats every year, there's so much variability in what everybody's collecting. I think that's what gets back to the problem of, sexual assault here is not the same as sexual assault here. So once everybody can kind of get on the same page, and once there's some agency, again, likely the FBI, pushing that down to everybody, that would be really critical. But unfortunately, from what we've heard, the next revision of the data standards that they're actually putting out won't be happening until 2020 or 2021. So we have 4 or 5 years where there's going to be this kind of muck and fog up until then.
I want a combination of free tools, open source, that's been tested, that helps deal in the privacy, re-identification, de-identification, and I also want something that would truly make significant change here would be funding, because federal government doesn't have a lot of power over local jurisdictions. It's a state versus federal thing unless there's money attached. So if money was given to every single department to do enhanced data collection and data reporting, and with that money came the data requirements, we would have far more involvement. Like the fact that not more than 15 states participate in NIBRs is appalling, but it's because you can't mandate. It's the nature of the beast of our government system is federal, state versus federal. So we would need Congress and the administration to come together and say, if we really truly want better data, we need to put some money behind that.
Sure. And just to build off that before we have Allison's remarks, so there was an article back there we wrote about the same funding issue related to the police data initiative, which doesn't have any money attached, but it's basically a convening role for all these different distributed police departments. And there are a handful of these funding strings through the Department of Justice, and they go to, it's things like excess equipment that the military doesn't use and they're sent to police, or it's funding for domestic terrorism threats in New York City that the police department gets. And this is millions of dollars they fund from DOJ. It's critical funding for them, but that is one of the kind of strings that the federal government could pull to incentivize better data collection. We'd love to work with you to identify more of those, because I think there needs to be a lot more focus on this. And if anyone in the audience knows about them too, please let me know.
I would have to say, if I had one thing to ask, as the clock's ticking on this administration, I would just say, for education, so kind of like what Amanda said about raising awareness, but just educating, I think, the executive level, at the top level, the chief level across these organizations, the value of location-based information. It kind of always makes me a little nervous when we talk about just doing things in stovepipes, because we don't want to create another silo of apps and data that's just for to solve one problem. But if there's a foundation in the back end, and IT and GIS is the system of record, all those apps on the front end to provide that engagement, that's the easy part. Like there's all kinds of apps that are there. It's just getting that back end worked out, because maybe you don't want to create maybe there are overlaps in drugs or the heroin overdose and assault and domestic. Maybe there's all these different indicators and characteristics that you need to really be able to do the analysis. It's great to have the point, but we really need to be able to get, I'm a root of the problem kind of person. It's great to be reactive to these things, but let's be proactive. And to do that, we need to really perform the analysis. And to do that, we really got to look at that back end.
Great. So, actually, Carrie, if you're still here, feel free to weigh in. Otherwise, we're going to turn over to audience Q&A. So, I believe the room is mic'd, so we should be able to hear you. Or we're running mics. So say your name, what your organization is if you're here in organizational capacity, and feel free to direct it at anyone. And then we'll be doing audience Q&A. So we'll have a mic being run around. So go ahead. But we're turning on the microphone. Okay, thanks, Eric.
Thank you. So my name is Emma Copeland. I work for a data and technology company called Fiscal Note in DC. We provide open access to government data, which is really awesome because the intersection of why I'm here today, while I was an undergrad, I'm a survivor and led a campus-wide activism program to address actually the point that Allison just made about proactive culture and education changes for students in particular, and I led a program and wrote a policy for Virginia specifically. I went to George Mason University, which is the largest public university in the state of Virginia, and our student health services is open Monday through Friday, 9 to 6, and if you look at data related to sexual assault on college campuses, that is not when you need to go to student health services. So I wrote a policy to address kind of a reallocation of resources from the Department of Education to kind of start having conversations with every student in the public education system throughout the state of Virginia. And it was a little bit laughed at when I brought it to Richmond, saying this is a Department of Justice issue, this is an HHS issue. So kind of to amplify and address some of the topics that are brought today about, so far we've been very reactive in kind of how do we need to use the data that's been collected already. And I'm wondering if we could continue to address the best ways we can be proactive in changing culture and conversation, because addressing rape culture and addressing the education of not only men but women and non-binary people across every state is, I think, the most important way to actually allocate resources for reactive and preventative care.
Feel free to respond. But so that's something that we've addressed to, or that we've actually talked about with Amanda, is that understanding, so like just because you have a resource available doesn't mean it's being used effectively. So we talked about how like really poor reporting mechanisms with HHS, like they don't track the number of certified sexual assault examiners in hospitals. That data just does not exist. They know they're there, but they have no idea if it's the right amount, or if they're like available, I'm assuming like at all hours of the night when you probably more likely need it during like business hours on a Tuesday. So that's a really important question. And yeah, that's not just a federal level issue, it's on the state level, it's on the local level.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for all the work that you've done, and for being an example of change. I hope we should talk about who you talk to, and I'm more than happy to get you to people who won't laugh. I've been there. You're absolutely right when it comes to making sure that we're not only being reactive but also proactive. And there are so many ways in which we can do it. You're doing one of those ways, and what RISE is trying to do is just make an issue land the map so that people can even start doing both, being reactive and proactive. But what you're doing is important, and let's talk after this about how we can work together.
And I love your point about culture change, is that I for the 16 years since I founded the Safety Net Project, I've seen people get really excited about the newest technology, the newest app, and they then become almost myopic and they focus just on that. And everybody who's out there working on open data, if you're not also challenging a rape joke, if you're not also weighing in when Leslie Jones is being attacked on Twitter, then you're not doing your part to change culture too. You can't just publish data and expect the world to change. So we have to be concurrently changing culture.
Great. Anyone else? Questions from Twitter? No questions from Twitter. So I guess plenty more to talk about. I mean, you talked about this before, and people who are in the tech community, like Fiscal Note or Matt or Allison, you've talked about the need to navigate information just about the criminal justice system, about the procedures a sexual assault survivor needs to go through. And we've discussed the idea of like a mapathon to just actually figure out, based on where you are, you should be able to Google and figure out the exact procedure you need to go through, just like a civil rights navigator map.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that issue, and then maybe Allison from a geospatial perspective, like how you can actually maybe coordinate queries about sexual assault to specific instances or to specific resources?
Yeah, it is really tough to find out information, especially when you need it, which is, and one example is survivors figuring out where do I go from here. As somebody who had to navigate it during my own trauma, I remember being so just layers deep on Google trying to figure out, this information, that information. And so in the process of researching for this bill, we gathered a lot of data. It is not comprehensive to everything that is out there. But one simple idea is just to share the information of the legal rights that exist in order for us to have created the bill. And what that means is we're trying to code a simple map. And again, it's not end all be all, just our information to share it with other people. You click on the state, it pops out what rights you have and don't have in that state. And you click on the right and it links you directly to that state code and state constitution. Something even as simple as that, it would have been helpful for me. And there are resources out there that have done similar maps. And so we're hoping in our next steps to coordinate and work with everybody who has already put some information together in their respective fields, and perhaps work with search engines like Google or Bing, so that when specific search terms are put in, like the hotline, this coded resource can pop up for people who are in need, and it will not only be a resource for survivors, but obviously for anybody who cares about the academics behind it, wants to understand it, wants to track the movement. Every time one of these rights passes, it will show up as something that is now codified.
I think that's awesome, and I especially think it's definitely a two-sided problem. So you have one side kind of from the survivor perspective saying, okay, how can I learn the most about my rights? On the flip side, you have all these departments, 18,000, that are beholden to their own standard operating procedures or their general orders, where they may, have the process coming down from the state level, but their interpretation may be a little bit different. So when you have these survivors that think they know exactly what's going on at the state level, depending on what department they interact with, there could be tweaks and changes and different expectations. So I think from one end, understanding kind of the broad perspective of what you should be expecting in terms of your rights is important. On the flip side, more consistency across all these departments on what they should be doing and how they should be handling it is really important. There's some organizations out there, like PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, nonprofit that does research and kind of best practices. They've been really big in the use of force lately, but also I think this would be something great for them to get into. But again, I think it's kind of a two-headed monster, so being able to attack it from both sides is hopefully part of the solution.
Question.
Yeah. Oh,
I've
yeah.
got a Twitter question.
Right.
Someone asking, you've given some examples of domestic police departments that are good examples. Are there any in other countries that maybe we can look to as good examples of police departments using data effectively?
For us, this is probably more of a question for some of our engineers, I guess. But we've seen the UK does a lot of good stuff in terms of kind of analysis and how to actually use data to deploy resources more effectively. Actually, one of the reasons that other countries actually do a really good job in this is that they don't have 18,000 police departments. I think the UK has 43 or something like that. So instead of, again, having all of this process and stuff fractured over so many different police departments. The fact that you can actually boil it down to such a small number of police departments really helps. So we see trends like that.
And also just to wait, so a couple months ago, I believe it was Montreal's police department had the same issue. They were really big on open data. They wanted to publish a lot of crime statistics, and they wanted to be able to map hotspots of home break-ins. And they had the same issue of like, if you can identify in the data set which home gets broken into all the time, that home's going to get broken into more because that was hit for security or something like that. And they had a really interesting needle to thread about how you can aggregate this data to make it not identify anybody's like address and put them at risk of being broken into, but still making that data useful so you can actually map, where police need to be patrolling more often, or where there's maybe not things like street lighting, which is like related to the increase in crime. From my understanding, that they did it to like a couple block level where it was like just specific enough, just granular enough where that data is useful, but no one could directly be harmed from it. Obviously, the considerations of sexual assault are different, but this is a universal problem in crime data. If anyone else wanted to weigh in on that, feel free.
I just wanted to go back to, Amanda was talking about creating that map that you could click on, kind of have that flash kind of thing that shows you like what your rates are. And then tying into what you were saying too about location, like where do I go? I would say, like as part of a smart safe community, initiative or smart safe, college initiative, to have like an app that's like the closest to. Again, it goes back to that consumerization. Like I can pick this up and find my closest Starbucks right now. But I've encountered people that have needed help, just in my personal, life. And immediately what I go to is I'm looking for a map, where's the closest shelter or where's the closest this? And I had a really hard time finding that. So I think that's a gap too that we need to fill is, that each community or college campus could have that. So if something's closed on campus, how do I get to, or call Safe Rise or whatever it is to get to that closest, whether it's an urgent care center or whatever it is that's set up in your community. But yeah, I really think a lot of you for doing that. Hits home a little bit. My daughter just started college this year, and I did exactly what you said earlier. I started looking at all the crime. When we were visiting colleges last year, I was, checking all the data, all the maps around, see what I could find. It's just not easy to find some of that data.
One of the challenges I get asked a lot, not only in the US, but internationally, people want to know what is the national hotline number in Bulgaria. And we have lots of sister networks we work really closely with. And one of the challenges we run into down to the granular local level of where can you get a sexual assault exam by a certified sane examiner on which hours at which hospital, that granular level data has to come from somebody on the ground who really knows. And when I worked at the local level, I knew which judge would sign a protection order, including custody, and which one wouldn't. Like the frontline rape crisis and domestic violence advocates doing life-saving work know incredible amounts of detail. Gathering that and then getting it into a database and having it vetted and updated so that as organizations open, close, merge is a huge lift, and it's a people lift. You really need people. You can create a portal and an app for it, but unless we have people who can actually really dig in and pull that data and get it up to date, we're getting bad data out. And the last thing I want to do is point somebody to an urgent care center where we say there's a sane nurse when there isn't one. And so you take a cab there or an Uber or a Lyft, and then you have to go to another hospital. So, that's one of the things I keep sort of harking back to is there is a technology component and then there's a people component. And if you try to do one without the other, we're going to fail.
Yeah, what are the resources there? Well, that would be an attribute to that point is we need to make sure that the resources are there before you would publish that information.
And now, thanks to the bill that just passed, states will technically have to have resources and then tell survivors what their rights are and where they can get those resources.
Another question?
I think I can probably project. Can folks hear me? Okay, just okay, great. Good morning. My name is Alicia Gill. I'm with YWCA USA, and I'm glad that you brought this up, Cindy. Hi. I wanted to hear a little bit about everyone's take. First of all, thank you all for being here, but I want to hear a little bit about your take on the synergy between, we've talked a lot about police and kind of congressional, that kind of big data. I'm wondering if someone can talk a little bit more about the synergy between the data that advocates are using and the way that frontline rape crisis center workers and domestic violence advocates are using, and what's the synergy with that between that and the data that police officers are using, and how can we kind of utilize that data the best?
Alicia's a longtime friend and former enemy to the intern. She's fabulous. My conundrum is for 40-some years, we have said that if you go to a local rape crisis center, if you go to a local domestic violence shelter, whether your perpetrator, offender, or rapist was the police chief, the neighbor, physician, or stranger, or your partner, no one will know you're getting help and getting services. I mean, we have held that line, and we've got it codified into federal law, and it's the strongest confidentiality law in federal code, and it's in the Violence Against Women Act, and it says you can't encrypt it, you can't hash it, you can't put duct tape around it. It is not allowed to be released to a third party, period. And so what we give funders is aggregate data, and that's vital because we really want to continue that 40 years of nobody knows you're a victim unless you choose to disclose. And the 2 survivors who disclosed here, like, it is a huge thing to say this happened to me and I'm going to share it publicly. But given the numbers, like half the room are probably survivors. And given that, it's your story to tell or not tell. So I actually I'm a big fan of keeping the data separate and using them for different purposes. Use your internal data to do really good self-reflection and program evaluation and really look hard at how you're serving survivors. When I worked in Maine, we had the largest French-speaking population outside of Quebec in the community I worked in Maine, and we didn't have a single French-speaking survivor come to us for services. We had a problem. And that's the kind of thing that nonprofits and victim service providers really need to look at their community and their own demographics and do that soul searching. But I actually want to keep a nice solid firewall between victim service provider data and government data, police data, health data, for a reason, because we want to keep that as a safe place that someone can go, because we know that the majority of survivors don't report to police, and there's a lot of reasons in that. Sometimes it's not about a bad police department, it's about I cannot bear to go through this system. I cannot handle the excruciating victim blaming process that will happen, and I respect that completely. I have no judgment at all, and so you may have the best force ever, great data collection, phenomenal system, and a survivor still wants to keep their own story private, and that's their right.
Great. So we've got about 2 minutes left, so a time for one more audience question or any closing remarks anyone wants to make. Anyone? Okay.
Hi, I'm Flannery. I'm with the higher education community, and I just wonder if you guys have any thoughts or suggestions on ways that college campuses can incentivize students to participate in some of these campus climate surveys where, they're really interacting, whether they use the services or not, but are a part of, the broader data collection and sort of know their resources. And I guess maybe this is two-pronged. It's either, from higher up and what college presidents and, provosts can be doing to make sure their students know they need to participate, because there's no real, mechanism, I think, to force students, graduate or undergrad, to participate, I think, in these surveys and be a part of this greater data collection.
I think if you can describe the outcomes and you can describe the initiatives that will come from collecting all that data, that means a lot to these student bodies. When you're collecting all this information and nothing actually happens with it, I think people will kind of be confused and a little bit, disillusioned with, all right, why did I just submit all that interesting information if nothing's going to be done with it? So I think that's pretty critical.
I agree. You need to understand what you're giving, why you're participating in the survey. I also think we can learn a lot from the research community that for a century has been basically saying, if you take time to give us your thoughts, we want to give a small token of appreciation, and a $5 gift certificate for coffee or ice cream goes a long way to say thank you for your time. We value your input, and the research community has done this for decades. If you participate in a focus group, you get a $25 or $50 gift certificate, and it's understood that we value people's thoughts and time.
Yeah, I would say, I can see that too from my daughter, just going on the campus, that they like to get involved in things. I think there was already a workshop, I think right as part of the first couple weeks of orientation, about conduct and self-defense and things of that nature. But maybe you can, targeting the sororities and fraternities and having them maybe get engaged in some type of an activity, whether they get like a bracelet or a t-shirt or like you're saying a coupon, they got to be a part of something and making their, their campus a smart, safe campus. That'll probably be a good idea. And like what Matthew was saying, focus on those outcomes as well. This is what you get. You get to have a campus that you can be proud of, and it's smart and it's safe, and we're engaging technology and we're looking after each other. I know something my daughter's done with all of their roommates is they've decided to opt in to Find My Friends, and they look out after each other. So if somebody's not back at a certain time or something doesn't look right, then they'll go to the app and and say, why are you not back yet? Are you okay?
If anybody's interested in the personal safety app space, we actually have an app safety center. We reviewed about 100 apps that are around preventing and ending sexual violence and domestic violence, and you can find it at techsafety.org.
Great. So it's 10:30. Unfortunately, to stop here. I believe feel free to grab anyone on their way out if you want to ask any more questions. As a reminder, there's a fishbowl in the back if you want to drop a business card and stay abreast of any the work that the Center for Data Innovation is doing in this space. We'll add you to our newsletter. And there's also a sign up on the laptop for RISE if you can stay involved as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And also this video will be online now. So, great, thanks.
As part of the White House initiative for PI, as you put together a white paper.